Hey guys, so this is going to be our MRT review for your test. Um, Remember, if you watch the video and answer the questions as we go, all right, and you can show me that you just watched the video in its entirety, you can get some bonus points for your test. Okay. So remember MRT being McKinley, Roosevelt, and Taft. Okay, three presidents that are going to end out the Gilded Age for us and push us into the progressive movement. Okay. Now, remember the very, very first president that we talked about with this unit was William McKinley. Okay. And so really quick hitting his domestic policy. Okay. Remember, he's going to adhere to a very typical economic policy for the Republican Party. Okay. With that, he wants high tariffs. He wants to protect American business. So he brings in the Dingley tariff, all right, which is going to increase tariff rates in the United States to 49%, right, on any goods that are being imported into the country. And so again, right, this was to ensure that American businesses were being protected. He's also going to initiate the Gold Standard Act, okay, not too long into his presidency. That Gold Standard Act, which is going to officially take us away from any type of bimetallism. It's going to get rid of free silver. And it's his way of saying that the United States is 100% on a gold standard. He also is president when the temperance movement starts to show its face. Now, remember, you will need to know the definition of temperance. It's in your notes. But remember, it just means that we are going to try to either limit consumption of alcohol or we are going to abstain entirely from it. And so remember, this movement was greatly led by the WCTU, okay, or the Women's Christian Temperance Union. I remember they were led by a lady named Carrie Nation, okay, who was the axe lady. Right? She had her axe and she had her Bible, and she would go into saloons and bars all across Kansas primarily, and then into parts of other parts of the United States. And she would destroy their bars, bust up their barrels of alcohol, destroy their places of business, all in an attempt to push this temperance movement, okay, which ultimately will lead us to the Prohibition Act. Okay, and we'll get the 18th Amendment that will outlaw alcohol in the United States. Now, remember, McKinley is also going to be a very large proponent of foreign policy, okay, primarily with imperialism while he is president. Okay. Now, first and foremost, with imperialism, make sure you know the various arguments for anti-imperialist and imperialist. Right. Remember, imperialists are looking at imperialism as a way to grow our markets for goods. So it's more people we can sell to. Right. We're also looking at it as raw materials, things that we can't get in the United States that we can go elsewhere and get. Okay. We also look at economic and military power. If we're able to go and take over territory, then we can expand economically, we can expand militarily. Okay. And then just overall humanitarian resources, meaning this is the reason, this was a lot of the justification that we gave for imperialization, right? Okay, we liked the raw materials, we liked the new markets, we liked the economic and military power we were getting, but the real justification that we gave a lot of the time, especially when we get to Teddy Roosevelt, okay, was that we were going to bring civilization to these people. We were bringing Americanization, we were bringing Christianity, English, education, technology to all of these people in all these different territories. One man you will need to remember is Alfred Thayer Mann. Okay, he wrote The Influence of Sea Power upon History. Okay, remember in that he told us to be weary of land birds. Okay, and if we didn't want to remain a land bird, meaning not able to go anywhere over the water, we needed to put an emphasis on getting overseas bases. Okay, which when we talked Hawaii, right, that was one of our reasons for wanting to take over Hawaii. In addition to the economic and agricultural resources there, right, we looked at it as a place to get a naval base, and we did in Pearl Harbor. Um, Remember, we're wanting to acquire land in the Pacific. That is where we are going. Okay, we see those as easy territories to take over. Okay, they would give us landing ports to other parts of Asia, okay, namely China. And so all of these things led the imperialists to saying this is a good thing. Now, anti-imperialists, remember, they looked at it as Americans being hypocritical. Okay. All right. They said that we're denying other people what we fought for the Declaration of Independence. Okay. We spent an entire war, right, fighting against the British, trying to gain independence. And now we're going and um, keeping that from other people. All right. Now, two places you need to make sure you know where they are on a map. Okay. Remember the activity that we did with the map, Hawaii. Okay. Know where this is on a map. Know geographically where it is located. Okay. Remember the McKinley tariff is going to crush much of the Hawaiian economy. I remember prior to it becoming a territory for the United States after it's annexed in 1898, it was its own independent kingdom, all right, led by Queen Liliuokalani, the monarch there. All right, but remember, we started pushing in, seeing economic interest, okay, primarily in sugar, but also in pineapples and other crops. Okay, and we also saw this as a place to put a naval base, all right, to kind of give us a halfway point in between the United States and China. Okay, now speaking of China, also make sure you know where this is on a map. Okay, geographically be able to point out China. Remember, with China, the biggest thing was the open door policy and everything that led to it. And we wanted to expand our sphere of influence, right? This circle, if you will, of how far the United States' influence and power stretched across the globe. Now, we did have run into one hiccup with that, and that was the Boxer Rebellion. I remember the Boxers were a group of Chinese nationalists, okay, who were very prideful in being from China and their Chinese culture, okay, and were very set on the ways of that culture, and they were very much set in the mindset that if anything was going wrong in China, then it needed to be completed and finished and fixed by the Chinese government and the Chinese culture, and that any Western influence from the Americas or Europe, okay, was nothing that they needed. I remember they ended up killing several missionaries and traders that had gone into China. And all of this ultimately leading to the open door policy, okay, done by John Hay. It took a few tries, right? We ended up with two variations of the open door policy, okay, right? But nevertheless, right, trade was opened up into China. Now, remember the asterisk with this is that you could not um, conquer China, right? You could not make China your territory, okay? But it opened up China to trade with much of Europe and the United States. All right, and so take a second really quickly and answer practice question number 1. Now, the next big topic we had was the Spanish-American War. Okay, make sure you know your causes here. Okay, you have the Cuban Revolution, and side note, know where Cuba is on a map. Okay, geographically. Okay, you know the Cuban Revolution. We saw all of these people who were being starved in Cuba, put in concentration camps, right? Okay, and understand that with these causes, right, it's a snowball effect, right? So it was just kind of one thing that led into another that ultimately pushed us into war with the Spanish. All right. On top of the Cuban Revolution, you had yellow journalism, right? This exaggerated news, almost fake news, right? That was becoming popular at this point in time. Right. You had all these headlines, okay, that reported on the Cuban Revolution, okay, showcasing starving women and starving children and mistreatment of women, right? Then you had the DeLome letter sent by Enrique DeLome, who remember was a Spanish ambassador who was housed in the United States. He was writing this letter back to the government in Spain. All right. In that letter, he was talking about how weak the American president was, about how weak McKinley was. And ultimately, the American press, the yellow journalist, right, got a hold of this and leaked it. Right. And it was put all across the United States about how the Spanish were making a mockery of the American government and the American president. And then finally, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back is the USS Maine, right? The USS Maine explosion in Havana Harbor, right? And it was immediately blamed on the Spanish, right? With no evidence whatsoever to support that claim. The yellow journalist took off with this and started printing headlines of "Remember the Maine." Okay. Now, later on, right, years later, we find out that it was actually an engine room issue, okay, that ended up in the explosion of several artillery shells that were on board the ship. But nevertheless, right, this leads us into the Spanish American War. And so remember, it was nicknamed by John Hay as the Splendid Little War, right? Because the United States did not lose a whole lot, but we gained big. Okay. All right, through the Treaty of Paris, Cuba becomes independent. Remember, this is what they were truly concerned with, right? That after the war was over, that they would be freed from Spanish rule, but then the United States would take their independence right away from them. But we gave them the Teller Amendment, right? That promised we would not do that. Okay. Also, through this, we gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, right? Three Spanish territories that we take over that we can now call ourselves an imperialistic nation as a result of. Okay. Remember, the Philippines was the only one that we paid for, okay, spending a whopping $20 million, okay, to buy this from the Spanish. All right, and then remember, not too long after this war ends, President McKinley will be assassinated in 1901 in New York City, all right, which will usher in Teddy Roosevelt to becoming president, okay, and serving as the youngest person to ever serve as president. Okay, and POTUS there just means President of the United States. Um, Now, a quick side note about Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War. Make sure you remember the Battle of San Juan Hill in Santiago, Cuba, where Teddy Roosevelt was made to be a war hero. Okay, he led the group called the Rough Riders, which remember was just kind of a ragtag bunch of soldiers. Okay, into San Juan Hill and ultimately an American victory, which is really going to push us, okay, into an overall victory in the Spanish American War, um, leading to that Treaty of Paris. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, domestic policy. Okay. The big thing with him is to know that he is going to start the progressive movement. Okay. And in this progressive movement, he has a lot of push for change. Okay. I remember his big ideas for change was his domestic policy, the square deal, okay, where he had his three C's. He had consumer protection, control of corporations, and conservation of natural resources. Okay. All right. He wanted to move forward. Okay. For labor goals, for social goals, he's going to challenge cities and urban problems and try to fix those. All right. He had political goals. Right. He was saying the people should have more power. And remember, we get the initiative, referendum, recall, and direct primary through him. Okay. All right, all of these being voter reforms. Okay, in addition to these, we get the Australian ballot or the secret ballot. Okay, all right, make sure you remember your progressive amendments 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th. Okay, all right, 18th and 19th being the new ones that we'll add here. Okay, the 18th being prohibition. All right, the amendment that is going to outlaw alcohol across the United States. Okay, and then the 19th that will give women suffrage. Okay, um, so the 19th won't technically come until the end of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. Okay, but it is considered a progressive amendment. All right, so make sure you know it for your test. All right, and there's just a repeat of the square deal. Okay, you have your three C's. Okay, and we'll just start with the first one you see there. This is the control of corporation. Okay, corporations remember just meaning a another word for business. Okay, or monopoly. Okay, and so you have the coal strike of 1902, which is where this will start. All right, remember essentially the situation that's going on is you have the workers who are going on strike and the owners aren't willing to make any type of amends. Okay, and so Teddy Roosevelt steps in, knowing how imperative coal is to our society at this point in time, and he uses arbitration. Okay, which remember it's just this negotiation with a middleman, right, where he essentially goes to the owner and says, "Look, if you do not figure this out, I will." I remember the sole purpose behind this was him trying to prove that the federal government had more power than the businesses. Okay, and understand that's a big theme of Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. Okay, is that we're going to see over the course of his time in office the expansion of the federal government. All right, remember he's also going to start the trust busting policies. Okay, where he's trying to distinguish between good trust and bad trust. Right, and he's going to start a process of eliminating these bad trusts. All right, he's going to put more regulations on businesses. He's going to give more power to the ICC. Okay, remember, especially with the railroads, right? We get the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act, okay, under Teddy Roosevelt, right, that are both aimed at regulating the railroads even more. With conservation of natural resources, we get the Newlands Act, okay, which remember is going to ensure that there is water allocated for farmers out west who need it. We get irrigation systems and dams. All right, we also see the U.S. Forestry Service and national parks. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt's going to set aside over 200 million acres, all right, of federal private land to be protected, okay, through the U.S. Forestry Service. Okay, they become game reserves, bird reserves, national parks, to preserve the natural resources that the United States has. All right, and so take a second really quick, all right, and answer practice question number 2. Now, his last C here is consumer protection, okay? All right, and consumer protection, remember, all right, you have your muckrakers to thank for a lot of the consumer protection laws that we get, okay? All right, make sure you know these 4 people, okay? You will have to match them on your test, okay? So Upton Sinclair, remember, he writes The Jungle about the meatpacking industry. Okay, and as a result of him, we get 2 laws, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, both intended to ensure that food and drugs are safe for consumption. Ida Tarbell highlights the history of the Standard Oil Company, where she talks about the bad and inhumane and unethical business practices of John D. Rockefeller and his Standard Oil Company. Lincoln Steffens writes Shame of the Cities, okay, which in that he discusses how utility companies are charging outrageous prices for various utilities, water, electricity, things of that nature. Right, and then Jacob Riis gives us How the Other Half Lives, which remember was a book of pictures, okay, where he would go into the slums of major industrial cities and he would take pictures of the tenements that immigrants were living in, people living on the streets, okay, trying to showcase right to the rest of the world, okay, exactly what these people were living in. Now, remember, that was the whole purpose of muckrakers. Okay, they would rake up the muck, right, and try to bring it to light of what society was like during the end of the Gilded Age, right? Trying to showcase to the rest of the country who either doesn't see it or refuses to see it, okay, of what some people are living through. All right, so make sure you know your progressive legislation and answer practice question number 3. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy, remember, is going to be very significant with imperialism. Okay? He's going to continue the mindset of imperialism that McKinley started. Okay, and remember, his major first thing that he does is the Panama Canal, and make sure you know where this is on a map. Okay. All right, remember the whole purpose we wanted that Panama Canal was to cut trade times in half. We could travel from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back again in about half the time instead of now having to go all the way around the southern tip of South America. Now, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is something you need to make sure you especially remember, makes us the police person for the Western Hemisphere. Okay, we have now taken on the responsibility, okay, of ensuring that the entire Western Hemisphere is safe and protected. Okay, and it started in the Dominican Republic. Britain was involved there, and we wanted them out. Okay, just like a lot of European imperialistic nations who had territories in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, the name of his foreign policy was Big Stick Policy or Gunboat Diplomacy. Okay, I remember the gunboat diplomacy being a tagline from the Great White Fleet that he puts together to build up the American Navy that he then sends around the globe, right? Okay, as a showcase of force that the United States had and likely to strike some fear, right, into smaller nations. All right, and then don't forget about his gentleman's agreement that he used to end the Russo-Japanese War. Okay, this arbitration that he gets involved between Russia and Japan. Okay, to end the war that had been going on with them, we ultimately make agreements with Japan. Okay, and that we would keep the Philippines, so we would keep our Asian stronghold and our territory there. Japan would have access to Korea. All right, this was our gentleman's agreement and ultimately led to the Treaty of Portsmouth. All right, that will end this war. Okay. All right, so take a second and answer your next practice question. Now, President Taft's domestic, okay, make sure you know the handpicked successor timeline, okay? We went over this in class. Okay, you will need to know the split between Teddy Roosevelt and Taft and be able to put some things in order. Okay, going with the Payne-Aldrich tariff. Remember that Taft intended to be a low tariff, but it ended up being a high tariff. Okay, and a lot of progressives didn't like that, including Teddy Roosevelt. All right. Okay. And then the Ballinger-Pinchot affair, where Taft fired Gifford Pinchot, okay, for not allowing them to spare some protected federal lands to build on. Okay. So this will cause a split in the Republican Party, will make Teddy Roosevelt upset, okay, and will lead to the creation of his third party, the Bull Moose Party, right, which he will try to run again in 1912 as a third party. Remember, Taft is a trust buster. Okay, over 90 antitrust lawsuits. Okay, and he's really going to push this policy of Teddy Roosevelt to regulate corporations. Okay, remember, he'll get to take the credit for bringing down Standard Oil. He's going to regulate railroads even more with the Mann-Elkins Act. Okay, and officially take away the ability of railroads to charge more for short hauls and less for long. But also remember, he has a big stain on his presidency with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, okay, which he tries to right with a lot of workplace safety laws. Okay, we're going to see more fire drills. We're going to see more fire prevention, fire protection, sprinklers, fire alarms, right? Escapes, okay, to prevent another episode like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. All right, and then remember Taft's foreign policy. Okay, it was called dollar diplomacy. Okay, and his big thing was that he was going to substitute bullets for dollars. Okay, all right, we were going to substitute European loans to Latin America with American loans. Okay, we were trying to get the European conquerors out and put our American influence in. Okay, and so not only did this increase our economic power in Latin America, okay, and ultimately led to a lot of imperialization in Latin America, okay, but it lessened the control that Europe had on the Western Hemisphere, okay, and so remember, another huge aspect of Latin America that we were trying to keep protected with this was the Panama Canal, okay, and so we were really doing everything we could, right, to ensure that we kept control there, but also were able to keep Europe out. Now, these people should be very familiar to you at this point. Okay, W.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. All right. The biggest things you'll need to know are listed here. So Booker T. Washington, remember his book that he wrote, Up from Slavery. Okay, he was born a slave and became a very prominent African American and civil rights fighter. Okay, remember their vast differences. Booker T. Washington will promote job training and vocational skills. Right, said Black people should focus on economic opportunities, accepted Jim Crow laws and segregation, and said that this is a system that we will have to work through, okay, and ultimately earn our civil rights. Right. W.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, right, urged African Americans to get an education. Right, didn't necessarily go after the vocational training or the trade skills. Okay, he demanded equality now. Right, he said that nobody should have to earn anything or deal with segregation or Jim Crow laws, that they should have equality immediately. He started the Niagara movement, okay, to do this, okay, with a protesting group. And then ultimately he helped found the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, right, where they will make landslide after landslide of gaining civil rights for African Americans. All right, make sure you answer your last question, practice question number 5. All right, so use this review as a resource. Okay, watch this video multiple times. If you have any questions, please let me know.